I have been fortunate enough to get to the financial position in my life at just 25 years old where I could very feasibly buy my own home, yet still I choose to keep renting. And in this video, I'm gonna explain why. A lot of people will think that,
oh, isn't renting throwing money in the toilet?
Shouldn't you be owning your home because then you're not paying someone else's mortgage? And in certain cases, that can certainly be valid, but there's a lot of detail on this that most people don't consider. Now, there's a lot of content on this topic of buy versus rent online, but the issue I had with almost all of the content is that it was all geared towards someone living in a particular place, specifically in the US or Canada or the UK. That assumes US property taxes and the specifics of how US mortgages works and taxes and things like this. But I am an international person. I live around the world. Specifically, I don't live anywhere in the West. So while a lot of the advice on those videos would apply to me, there were many things, like specific things to my situation as a nomadic person, as an expat, that simply wasn't applicable. So I had to do my own research. So if you moved abroad, or you're considering moving abroad, or you're a digital nomad, or you live in multiple places, then I hope that this video can be the most relevant video for you on the topic of buying versus renting. Now, if you live in one place, if you live in the West, this video will still apply to you, but I want to talk about this topic in a more general way, in a more first principles kind of way, rather than speaking about the specifics of this decision in the case of one particular country. So I want to give you a high level sort of framework to think about this so that hopefully you can make the best decision for you. Now, there are many things to consider when you're considering buying versus renting, and I've sort of divided this into financial and non-financial factors, because on one hand, you could look at buying a home as simply an investment just like any other, but on the other hand, there are many other considerations outside of just the finances that you really ought to consider before making the decision. So let's talk about all of those. First, on the financial side. So the way I view investing into a home, like a personal residence, is on one side is just as a pure investment, just like any other investment, where the thing that matters is how much of a return am I getting on that investment, specifically relative to other investments, so other places where I could have that same money. For example, let's say I invest $400,000 into a home. What I'm going to compare the return I'm able to get on that $400,000 is to the average 7 to 8% return of the S&P 500. For example, if I can earn 10% of my money by putting it into real estate, then that is good, and that makes it a good investment because it's more than where I could get on that money elsewhere. Whereas if I only get 5%, then that is not a very good investment because I could easily get more than that by investing it into index funds, or in this environment, especially with WEO Bank that I have here in Dubai, I could literally get 5% just on my bank account guaranteed. Now, if you rent your home out, and this is going to be broadly oversimplified, the way you would calculate your return on your home, like on an annual basis, is by just taking the rental income, the total rental income that you're able to get by renting it out, minus any expenses. Now, that includes any maintenance expenses, any taxes that might be applicable in your country, and also minus the interest that you would have to pay on your mortgage if you're taking out a mortgage. And that would get your net rental yield, and you would compare that to the purchase cost. But how would I calculate the return on my investment if it's a place where I'm personally living? Well, the way I think about it, I think about the sort of rental income of that place as the rent that I am saving by owning that place compared to not owning the place and renting an equivalent place. For example, if I know that if I was renting the place that I could be buying for $400,000 for $4,000 a month, that is $48,000 a year, what I would then do is deduct any expenses that I would have if I'm owning the place, and that would become my net rental, sort of virtual rental yield, as I like to think about it. And what I forgot to mention is that obviously with that number, I would then add the expected annual growth of the property market in whatever area I am buying. In the case of the UAE, for example, if it is 3%, then I would add that to the net rental yield, and that would in fact be the total return that I would anticipate to get from my real estate investment. And then if that number is lower than what I could have by having that money elsewhere, then I will conclude that buying the place just purely on the financial side is not a good investment. But if it's higher, then I will conclude that this is a good investment. Now, this is an oversimplified calculation, and there's a few other financial considerations that you want to consider to truly get what is your actual net yield build on that investment. First is how long will you stay there in a year? Now, for most people who live the normal life where they live in just one place, this is not really consideration because you're living in one place for the entire year. But consider a situation like me where I live in Dubai for 7 months of the year, and for the rest of the year, I don't live in that place. That means that really I'm only saving the rent by owning the place for that 7 months. Now, sure, I could rent the place out for the rest of the year, but chances are I'm not going to be able to rent it for the entire year. There's going to be some vacancy period. Chances are there's going to be some time when I'm not able to find a tenant instantly, things like this. So I would need to factor that in. The other consideration is how long will you have that place for? The thing to consider with buying a place is that in almost any country, there's going to be some kind of sort of flat fees that you're going to have to pay when you're buying and or when you're selling. For example, in Dubai, I know it's going to be around 4% of the property value that you're going to have to pay in agent fees, government fees, all other kinds of fees, taxes, things like this. So let's say you buy a place and then you sell that place the next year, that 4% on, let's say, this 400,000 property will come out to an extra cost of $16,000 that you're going to have to deduct from that net rental yield. However, if you stay in that place for a full 10 years, that fixed $16,000 cost can be divided up for 10 years, which means the extra cost per year is only going to be $1,600. And this brings us to the first big reason why I personally yet have not bought a property. Now, I'm in a fortunate position where I've been able to build an online income that allows me to live around the world in a very tax efficient way, meaning I pay 0% income tax and I get to live in places where I don't pay crazy rents and crazy cost of living. That means I'm able to increase my net worth extremely quickly relative to the average person, which means that what I could afford to buy in 2 years, 3 years will be significantly higher than what I could afford to buy now. So let's say I bought a property now, I know for a fact that in 2-3 years, I will no longer be happy with the place that I have now because I can see all the better places that I could now afford. So I don't want to buy now because I know I'd end up selling the place in a couple of years just to get a better place, which would mean I'm essentially wasting a lot of these fees and I could really well end up losing money on that investment relative to where I could have that money elsewhere and simply have the return on those investments paying my rent and not having to worry about the hassle of buying and selling. So really, I want to wait to buy until I'm in a position where I can afford the kind of place that I know I'm going to be happy with for at least 5 to 10 years. And again, to get the real number and like all the things, like all the fees that you need to consider, you need to look at the case of specifically where you live, were you considering buying, are you getting a mortgage, are you buying cash, things like this. But this is sort of just high level framework that I use to think about on the financial side, whether it makes sense to buy or rent. But there are also many non-financial factors that you need to consider. And I divided this into sort of pros and cons. The first pro of owning is that you have this feeling that this is your home. It is your home that you can decorate in whatever way you want. It's just a nice feeling to know that the place where you are is yours and you know that you can do whatever you want with it. You can have your stuff there, you can have your office there. You know your landlord can't kick you out and things like this. So if you really value that stability, then even if that home might be a bad investment purely in the financial terms, it might still make sense to buy if you really value that stability and peace of mind that gives you. And this is a big reason why eventually I will want to buy. Eventually I want to get to the situation where I have 2 bases around the world. One is probably going to be in Dubai and one is going to be somewhere in Asia, perhaps Singapore or Bali. I don't know where it is yet, but then I want to own places in both of those places. So then I can just alternate between those 2 places. And I know that there's 2 homes in the world in the kinds of places where I want to live that are mine, where I can in both of them have my stuff, my office, my clothes, things like this, but just not yet. And the first con on the non-financial side is that buying a home sort of ties you down. Now, it doesn't necessarily tie you down because of course you can rent it out when you're not there and things like this, but it is sort of like you're putting a large chunk of your net worth into one specific location. And if it's a place where you actually want to live, just like we discussed, less time you spend there in a year and the less time you have that place for, the worse of a financial investment it is going to be. So you're really going to feel like you now have to live in this place for quite a long time. And especially if you're someone like me who loves to travel around the world, who loves to check out different countries. I mean, I keep moving around like every month right now, and I really enjoy this life of checking out all these different places. I'm not really ready to be tied down to one specific location, and not just one country, but one city and one specific location and area in a city. I'm just not ready for that because I want to experience a lot of different places around the world before I can make that kind of decision. Now, a big pro that I haven't seen many people talk about is that when you own a home, it is a real asset. What do I mean by this? Well, what I mean by this is that let's say you have all of your net worth worth in the stock market and the stock market completely crashes, like it loses 60% of its value or something like that, at that point, there's nothing else that you can do with those assets than just look at the number. Like there's nothing real behind them. I mean, I know there's real companies, but you can't really use those things into anything real. Versus if you own a home, if the value of that home goes down, sure, it sucks, but it's still a real house, it's a real home where you can live, that you can actually use for some like real practical purpose. The big con, which is also one big reason why I haven't yet bought, is that owning a home is kind of a headache. Now, let's say you owned a home that's earning net 7% versus owning a stock portfolio that is earning net 7%. Well, I would argue that while these two assets return the same percentage technically, you're still better off owning the stock portfolio because the home is going to be a bit of a headache to manage. Even if you're living there yourself, you're going to have to deal with repairs, with maintenance, or your toilet's broken, like the pipes burst, like all these kind of things. Whereas with a stock portfolio, it's just there and it's just bringing you money. You're not having to actively do anything to manage it. And you can focus all of your time on your main active income source, like your business or your career, where you can actually make more money. And finally, a big con is that when you buy a piece of real estate, you're putting a lot of eggs into one basket. When you own an index fund, you're automatically diversifying your money into a bunch of different places. And you can very easily like diversify your money into a bunch of different funds, a bunch of different bank accounts, like instruments, things like this. But when you're buying a real piece of real estate, you're having to put a very large chunk of your money into this one physical property in one physical place in the world, where if something happens to that particular location, that economy, that place, then a large part of your net worth can suddenly just go away. So I wouldn't want to own a home until I can do it in a way where I'm not putting even 50% of my net worth into this residence, because I don't want to have all of my eggs in one basket. I think that's just quite dangerous. But most people don't think it this way. They have the one personal residence that's pretty much their entire net worth. For sure, if nothing happens, then that's fine. But if something happens to that home, then suddenly their entire life's work can just be gone. And I don't want to be in that situation. And there's many different ways of thinking about this question. There's many different factors to consider. This is just the way I think about it. So I hope if you're now considering this, and especially if you are a nomad, perhaps this has given you a few special considerations for your situation that you might not have heard before. With that said, if you want to see another video from me, I will let YouTube recommend the best video for you right there. With that said, I'll see you in the next one.